Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a time of worship on a Good Friday here in the Okanagan. It is a delight to see that you are here, that so many of you have joined us. My name is Bob Wallace, and I'm here with my colleagues in ministry, Cheryl Perry, Linda Ervin, and Ivy Thomas. And together with Jessica Crawford and a host of hundreds whom I will be mentioning in a few moments, we're here to provide a service that we hope will help you sense more about how the ancient story fits our modern day. The script for this service was written by the Illustrated Children's Ministry, LLC, and purchased for use this year with permission for the congregation use. It is a copyright script, and we're delighted that they have allowed us to use it. I need to say some thank yous because this service has gone and become quite an experience for me. Jessica Crawford and her wonderful musical skills, both on the keyboard and later, as you'll see, as she leads us in singing. To Kim Dukes, John Whitehead, Lorraine Hladek, Nancy Hilmer, Moira Pritchard, and Ken Westering for reading the meditations that were so beautifully written and adapted for them to use. To the people like Kendra Berg and Mike Chasen, Karen Cranabetter, Ralph Milton, and Myrna Stark-Leader, who shared with me a lot of the photographs that you'll see during the production, and to Regina Burt, Burl Itani, Myrna Stark-Leader, Ivy Thomas for their graphic renderings as well. And I would not have been able to do it without the ministry team that is around me, and particularly the folks like Sophia Andriassi and Lorraine Hladek, who are serving as tech support for me today. So I want to say thank you to everybody. It takes the work of a lot of people to make these sorts of things happen. And now we're going to move into the more formal part of worship.
Gathering here in the central Okanagan, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded land and territory of the Selk'nam peoples, the Okanagan and West Bank First Nations, whose stewardship of this land we acknowledge and with whom we seek to build equitable and lasting relationships.
It is Friday at 3 o'clock, and we gather. We gather to remember. We gather to weep. We gather to try to understand the insanity of it all. We gather, knowing that in this time of worship, in our moments of deepest pain and sorrow, God is with us. We gather in worship and in prayer.
Over the weeks of Lent, we have extinguished candles, watching the light slowly fade as we've drawn closer to this day. Today, the final candle is extinguished as we recall the events of this day. Only in light of Easter would we dare to call this day good. We gather in the shadows at mid-afternoon, remembering that our scriptures tell us it was about 12 o'clock when the sun stopped shining and darkness covered the whole country until 3 o'clock. It is in this hour that Jesus gave up his spirit and died on the cross.
Suffering, love, the bread of life.
Let's join in a moment of prayer. Join me if you feel comfortable with the words. Wild and unruly one, so much around us is in flux. The world is changing and our lives are upended. Though we crave stability and security, give us the courage and patience to wait for your guidance. Sustain us through our discomfort and reveal the pathways to changes that last. Amen. We're about to move into something that I haven't done before, and I'm just learning how to do this. But we are going to have a videoed production of some of the meditations with the scriptures, and we hope that you will enjoy this opportunity to see and hear the story in this way.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry?" 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing."
What don't you know? I've sometimes been asked to play a role in a larger project I don't totally understand, or I've asked other people to participate in a project I don't fully explain. It always seems harmless enough. I ask my kids to hold their place in the grocery store lineup, and I say I'll be right back. But I don't tell them where I'm going. I ask a friend to loan me money and promise to repay her the next day. But I don't say what I'm going to spend it on. Someone else asked me to read a paragraph out loud on cue, even though I haven't heard the larger story, and don't know how it all fits together. My kids say yes, my friend hands me the cash, I agree to read out loud, partly because those are trusted relationships, partly because those are easy things to do, partly because it seems like it's more trouble than it's worth to challenge or say no for what's being asked of you. Sometimes we say yes when we ought to challenge or learn more, or what's being asked of us. Sometimes we do things we wouldn't if we understood more. Some things we'd never be part of if we recognized the hurt they would cause. It's like when my sons wrestle each other, playing, laughing, noise making at the beginning. These scenes often end with one of them being hurt, not because one meant to hurt the other, but because they got carried away and they don't notice when the play becomes rough. If they knew that game would end in tears, they probably wouldn't start it. But it's hard to see that far ahead. Or like someone who tosses a piece of trash on the ground. It's hard to see how something so small makes a difference. But when the wind picks up that trash, carries it far from where it was tossed, into the woods, or out in the ocean, or a curious creature crawls up to it or swims near it and gets tangled up in it, the creature loses its ability to crawl or swim. The person who tossed the trash never intended for that to happen. But rarely can we know all that might unfold from our actions. We just don't understand, see, or recognize. At times that because we don't try very hard. At other times it's because we can't fully know how those consequences ahead of time. And sometimes it's because we're just plain wrong about what we're doing. Jesus knew this. He knew this even about the people who were part of his last moments, moments that were filled with pain, sorrow, and hurt. He knew they really didn't understand what they were doing, that they were caught up in lies, and they didn't recognize the lies they'd been told. They didn't fully people made in those moments could separate them from God's love. He used some of his last words to tell them this. Perhaps Jesus suspected they would understand this moment differently later on. Don't we too see things differently, sometimes more clearly, once they're over, rather than while they're happening? It may even be as soon as they heard him speak those words about how much they didn't understand that they began to understand a bit more.
And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leader scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine. They said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? and we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
How do you know what's true? It can be hard to know what's true when we're in pain. Remember the last time you were really hurt? Maybe you fell and skinned your knee. Or maybe you fell farther and harder and broke your arm. Or maybe your heart hurt because a friend was mean to you. When you're hurt or sad, those feelings can be really big. They can take up all the space in your mind, and it can be hard to remember that more is true than just what we feel at that moment. It can be easy to focus on just those feelings and hard to remember the good things that surround us, the people who care for us, the big and small ways we are loved every day. All of that can be overshadowed when we're in pain, but that doesn't make it any less true. The Gospel of Luke tells us that two others were also with Jesus, hung on crosses on either side of him. And one of them asked Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied with words that seem unbelievable. "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Maybe Jesus knew those words would sound unbelievable. Maybe that's why he added, "Truly, I tell you," to the beginning of his promise. He had to say something to convince the man at his side that what was around them at that moment, their own pain and suffering, the sadness of those around them, the cruelty of their situation, was not all that was real. It was surely intense and overwhelming, maybe even all-consuming. It would be understandable if Jesus and the men next to him felt like their pain was the only certainty, the only thing that was real in that moment. It would have been understandable if they had had trouble seeing anything past the horror of the situation they were in. But the man who asked Jesus to remember him must have had some hope to begin with when he spoke that request. He must have known something about Jesus, must have heard stories of how Jesus made seemingly impossible things real, fed the hungry multitudes, healed those who had been sick for ages. Maybe the man thought, if Jesus can turn those hopeless situations around, maybe he can do something for me here and now. And Jesus helped that man to trust that he had good reason to hope when he told him this truth, that they would be together in something better, something beyond where they currently were. When the man makes this request of Jesus, and when Jesus responds, the two are together in a terrible moment. Have you ever shared a moment of sadness or fear of pain with someone? Seeing another person's struggle can deepen our own struggle. Maybe that's why we sometimes look away when those around us are hurting. But seeing another person struggle can also help us. It can reassure us that we are not alone in our pain. It can connect us to each other in important ways. Instead of increasing our hurt, it can lessen it. An old saying suggests that sharing our sorrow halves it, and sharing our joy doubles it. The promise here is that though Jesus and this other man share their struggle in this scene, they will also be together in paradise. That is, in a place of joy and delight. The promise is this: some sort of transformation is coming. We don't know much about what Jesus thought would happen after death, We know different branches of Judaism of his time had different ideas about what life after death might be. We do know that he prayed and taught his disciples to pray that God's will and God's power and God's love would be made real on earth as it is in heaven. And maybe by offering that promise of peace and paradise to the man at his side, Jesus was helping to make it real right where he was.
For us to be betrayed, scourged, mocked, and buried. He bore the shame for us, and death for us at length gave up his breath.
Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home.
Where is your family? With these words, Jesus continues some of the most important work he did in his life, even as he's dying. He turns people toward each other. He offers them to each other. It's what he did when he called disciples, taught and trained them, and sent them out together to teach and to heal. It's what he did when his relatives came looking for him, when he was attracting a lot of attention, drawing a crowd. When people said, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you," Jesus expanded the notion of family, widened that idea beyond those to whom he was related, to include all of the people he was with, saying, "This is my family. All who do the will of God are my family." And from the cross, Jesus sees two people who love him most, his mother and his dear friend, both in pain. And with some of his very last words, he gives them to each other. I experienced how important this kind of grief giving is at one of the saddest times in my life. After a person from my group of college friends was killed, the rest of us were shocked. We came to her funeral numb. We left in silence. We couldn't believe it, and we didn't know what to do. A year later, on the anniversary of her death, another friend called and suggested we all meet at a restaurant to remember her. I thought this was a terrible idea. I could only imagine our sadness deepening, our anger intensifying when we got together. But I went. We didn't say much at first. We picked at our food, swirled our drinks. We shared updates about jobs, apartments, other friends who weren't there. Finally, someone said, "Do you remember when?" and began to tell a story about our friend. And we did remember. And that first story sparked another, and then another, until we were all laughing and hugging and ordering more food and drinks and staying late into the night. The gathering to remember our friend has become a tradition. She was not with us, of course, but our shared love for her had brought us together. And because of that, not only would we always remember her, but we would come to love her and each other in new ways. Jesus knows his mom and his dear friend are entering into deep sadness, real anger, and lots of questions that don't have answers. He knows surviving this loss may be the hardest thing they've ever done. Like any grief, theirs will be complicated, and it will remain with them for a long time. They will hear his voice and look for him, forgetting that he's not there. They will prepare his favorite dinner and be overwhelmed with sadness that he can't enjoy it. They will see people he taught carry on his work and wish he could see it. And they will see people he taught ignore his work and wish they could make everyone respect who he had been. Memories of him will consume them some days. Others, they will be distracted and feel guilty for only thinking of him once in a while. That's why he gives them to each other. He knows they need each other. He knows that when one of them is sad or angry or stuck in questions, the other might say, "Do you remember when?" and tell a story about him. And he knows that won't make everything all right, but it will remind them that they share a love for him, and it might help them to grow to love each other too. Love can help us remember and honor what was, and it can reassure us that what we've cherished will, in some way, always be with us. And that love might be just what they need to see each other through this loss and into a new day.
From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah."
My God, why? This fourth word is among the hardest to hear. Jesus, the one who so closely communed with God that people knew God through him, felt God's love and grace and healing just by being near him, cries out here in pain. He knows God is always with him, but he can't feel that in this moment. He knows God loves him, and yet this struggle makes him feel alone, makes him feel like God isn't paying attention. He seems to be asking, is there any sense in his suffering? Or, for that matter, in any suffering? These words are hard to hear, but they say more than they might appear. These words are a code or a cue for anyone who might have been near the cross listening, or for anyone who might be hearing or reading the story years later. Jesus uses these words from the beginning of Psalm 22. The Psalms are the songbook and the prayer book of Jesus' community. And this psalm is a dialogue between two voices, one desperate, persecuted, nearly hopeless, the other confident in the memory that God has always been with him and his people and promises to always be with him. Here's the beginning of the conversation. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Because the Psalms were Israel's songbook and prayer book, anyone who heard Jesus cry out from the cross would have heard not just the words he said aloud, but after that, this whole conversation. If someone sings, Jesus loves me, this I know, and trails off, maybe your mind continues with the next line, for the Bible tells me so. That's what we can imagine happening here. Jesus cries out, and his words give voice to his sorrow, his loneliness, his pain. They also hint that all is not lost, that God, who has journeyed with God's people through all of history, is still by their side now, even in the depths of despair. That truth doesn't make the pain Jesus speaks from any less. It doesn't erase it or take it away, but it does let us know that the pain and agony are one part of a larger, longer, unfolding story. It's a reminder that as far as Jesus felt from God at this moment, this is not all that is. It doesn't answer his question of why, or any of the other myriad of questions that are asked, but maybe it answers a different question. Maybe sometimes there are no answers to his or our questions of why. What this psalm answers instead is the question of where. Where is God? Where is our hope? Where is the love that every single one of us was born into, that promised to hold us forever? And the answer, even when all else is unknown, is always here.
There is more unknown to you than Lord of glory see. Made a sacrifice for you, dying on the blessed tree. Is finished, here is God, trust in Christ and learn to die.
After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth.
What do you thirst for? In the summer, I thirst for water. After a long run or following an afternoon swimming in the lake, nothing feels better than pouring a tall glass of water and gulping it down. When the seasons change and the leaves turn color, I love a cup of warm apple cider. The slight spice is so comforting, like a hug to take away the chill. And in the winter, there's nothing cozier than sipping a mug of hot chocolate, Bonus points if it's near a fireplace. When we thirst, often it's our body's way of telling us that we need something, that we lack something. Sometimes it's a cup of liquid we crave, and sometimes it's something more than that. Sometimes our spirit is telling us that there's something missing, there's something not quite right, there's something more that could be. Sometimes what we crave is an answer to satisfy our curiosity, or a friend to feel connected to, or new understanding to make sense of the world around us. Jesus uses some of his last words to say he's thirsty. Does that surprise you? I wonder if the people around Jesus were surprised to hear him say he was thirsty. I wonder if they expected something more profound when he began his sentence. Earlier in this same story, the Gospel of John, he's been heard saying, I am the bread of life, and I am the light of the world, and I'm the good shepherd, and I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the true vine. I wonder if here he said, I am, and people around him leaned in, thinking they might hear one more revelation, one more metaphor, one more saying that would shed light on just who Jesus was. I wonder how they felt when they heard him finish that sentence with, thirsty. Maybe they felt relieved. Here finally was an I'm statement they could understand. They knew what it meant to be thirsty. Maybe they felt frustrated. Here was something they might have been able to help with. If only they had a jug of water. If only they had a way of reaching Jesus. Maybe they felt saddened. Here Jesus was, having been mocked and tormented by people who thought he was a threat, having been left alone by those closest to him. And instead of saying he's heartbroken or distraught or in pain, he just says he's thirsty. And in this story, someone wet a sponge in a jar of sour wine and held the sponge to Jesus' lips. They heard his statement as a request for liquid, and they met it. But I wonder if, even after that gesture, was Jesus still thirsty? I wonder if he was thirsty for justice and for righteousness. That is, for a world in which everyone has what they need, and no one suffers at the hands of another. I wonder if he was thirsty for living water, like he'd offered the woman at the well when he told her who he was. I wonder if he was thinking about the way water dedicates people to God, like in baptism, or the way water helps people serve each other, like in foot washing. I wonder if he was remembering his own baptism with his friend John, with the voice from God calling him beloved. I wonder if he was, in those most difficult and lonely moments, yearning for some kind of connection like that. And so he said, I am thirsty. And I wonder how we can help answer those people in our world today who are thirsty for water, for connection, for justice.
When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
What is finished? The sixth phrase seems clear enough until we ask the obvious question, what is finished? What is it exactly that ends here at the cross? It's not Jesus' ministry. He's training disciples to carry that on. And it's not his teachings. For thousands of years now, people have been retelling the stories he told. And it's not his presence. He promised that whenever two or more people got together and remembered him, he'd be there among them. And it's not his love. We're assured that not life or death or anything in the world can separate us from his love. So, what is finished here? The question becomes more complicated when we think about what can be meant by finished. Is this a good thing? Like when someone who's been sewing a quilt or writing an essay can announce proudly, the work is done. Or is it a thing to be mourned? Like when friends decide to go their separate ways. Or when a neighborhood store closes its doors for the last time. Maybe Jesus means that the experiment is over. This incredible moment of God on earth with people as one of us. Maybe that's what finishes here. In Jesus, God was born like any one of us, lived and learned and ate and drank and danced and cried like any one of us. And here he died like so many of his time died. Maybe the crucifixion is the finishing of God's experiment in a human body. If that's what it is, maybe this ending is both a good thing and a thing to be mourned. We can celebrate that it was, that it happened, that God journeyed alongside people like us, prayed with them, joked with them, cared for them, and let them care for him too. We can celebrate that God made friends with us, that God understands what it is to be one of us, in a body, in the world. We can celebrate that people kept and told and collected the stories, so that even though we're in a very different time and space, we can know something of what it was like. And we can mourn that it ended the way it did, that people didn't understand the miracle right in front of them. We can mourn that those in power were so scared of the challenge Jesus spoke that they let their fear win out over their hope, and in that moment ordered his crucifixion instead of considering his call to live in a new way. We can mourn that in too many ways and in too many places, still today, fear wins out over hope. When we turn our backs or close our doors to those in need, when we don't speak up against the cruelty we see and hear around us, when we refuse to listen to the prophets around us today who speak, who challenge, and who point to a better way. Maybe, thinking back to this moment, we can find the strength to say, we are finished with letting fear win in our own hearts, minds, lives, and communities. Maybe, like Jesus' first followers, we can find ways for hope and justice and the life-giving message of his love to carry us forward. We say, we are finished with letting fear win every time we welcome a stranger, or offer kindness to someone in need, or stand up for what's right, or listen to and believe those who tell the stories of their pain and point us to a new way. And we can remember that since God is alive in each one of us and in everyone we meet, the story of God with us, God among us, might change. It might lose some characters along the way and introduce some new ones, but it will never really be finished.
Sometimes he speaks words of love, and then yours be silence wide. Mercy on the souls of all. Jesus, our love is crucified. Oh, love of God, your sin-filled word, in this drought your strength is tried, and if the weary remains with God, Jesus, our love is crucified.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly, this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
Where does your spirit go? Who holds it? The language of this last word, like the language of the fourth, is coded. It says what it says, and so much more. It's a hint at a much bigger story. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Jesus isn't the first to speak these words. He didn't compose this line as he drew his final breaths. This statement is a prayer of his people. It's taken from the 31st Psalm. In you, O Lord, I seek refuge. Do not let me ever be put to shame. Incline your ear to me, rescue me quickly. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hands I commend my spirit. You have redeemed me, faithful God. These last words are not a giving up. Jesus does not speak them and hang his head. They are fighting words. He uses his very last breath to make sure they are heard. And with these words, Jesus says to the powers that surround him, to the empire that used weapons and threats to rule over people, and to the religious leaders that were too afraid to defy that empire, Jesus says, I do not belong to you. I do not belong to your violence, and I do not belong to your fear. Jesus said it, but he wasn't the first to say it. He wasn't the last either. People all over the world continue to speak these words, inspired, defiant, whenever they trust that God's promises are stronger than whatever terrible circumstances they face. People say these words whenever they create hope for those around them, that what currently is does not always have to be. I do not belong to you. I do not belong to your violence, and I do not belong to your fear. That's what a group of artists said when, in March of 2016, they came together on the Ivory Coast to film a music video in the place where a terrorist attack had been committed just weeks before. They wrote a new song celebrating life and denouncing hatred. They danced and clapped, and in a show of solidarity held hands and sang, "You cannot make us hide, même pas peur, we are not afraid." Just as Jesus spoke to God through prayer, they sang and danced, saying violence does not claim our spirits and fear does not work here. I do not belong to you. I do not belong to your violence, and I do not belong to your fear. That's what that restaurant owner in New York City said when the attacks of September 11th, 2001 had destroyed so much. He knew people would need to gather to feel safe. When every other place had boarded up their doors, he threw his open and made giant plates of pasta and found a chair for anyone who could come and played music that would be good for their souls. He hugged each person that arrived. When people called because they heard the restaurant was open, they said, "Do we need a reservation?" And to everyone, the owner said, "Just come." Just as Jesus spoke to God through prayer, their open invitation was a clear message. Violence does not own us, and fear will not hold us. The crucifixion, this part of Jesus' story, is horrible, like any murder is horrible. And it's unjust, like any execution is unjust. And it is heartbreaking, like every loss is heartbreaking. And this horror, this injustice, this heartbreak, it's a part of this old story, and it's still very much a part of our stories today. So where does your spirit go? Who holds it? The one we mourn on Good Friday said to the one who was with him always, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." These words are offering and reunion. They are remembrance, words spoken by his people for generations. And they are reverence. These are the words with which he acknowledges that he is not his own. And they are resistance. These are the last words from the cross. And with them, Jesus says, "This is not the last word. I do not belong to you. I do not belong to your violence, and I do not belong to your fear. Into your hands I commend my spirit." Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote a prayer, and we will end with this prayer and then the music of Were You There. We encourage you to go out in silence to wait for the Easter rise. Join me. Goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than hate. Light is stronger than darkness. Life is stronger than death. Victory is ours through the one who loves us. Amen.